There's a new way to stay connected and know what's happening with Market to Market when you subscribe to Market Insider. One email and a lot of information awaits you. Go to markettomarket.org and subscribe to Market Insider. Welcome in. It's time to talk weather, and who better than Eric Hunt from the University of Nebraska Extension. He's one of our, I think, Eric, I get to call you now a regular weather analysis from Eric Hunt. How do you think of that?
Hey, I love it.
This is the M2M podcast. Eric has really embraced Market Journal. You see it on his shirt there. But you've also taken in a couple of market-to-market things here lately. What if we saw you in Lincoln back in March? I think we've talked about that. Are you still watching the show? Are we doing okay?
Every Saturday morning. Yep, you guys do great. Yep, love the guys you bring on for market analysis. It kind of helps me keep tabs on what's going on, get a feel for things in this part of the country.
So we're talking weather today and climate and all sorts of crazy things because that's what we all talk about this time of year. What's the current state of weather in let's start with the grain states.
Well, right now things are pretty warm. I mean, we just finished a nice little cold snap earlier in the week, late last weekend, and some places had some decent snowfall. But we're flipping back. So it's Thursday we're recording this. We're going to have record warm temperatures across probably good portions of Nebraska tomorrow, maybe parts of western Iowa. Very warm getting into the weekend, pretty much the entire central U.S. And then we should actually start seeing some chances for moisture coming back this next week. So that's the good news. The bad news is there really hasn't been much moisture for a lot of places last, depending on your location, 30 days, some cases just going back, about midsummer. But I was actually just looking at some of the drought statistics this morning, and the state of Illinois is close to 50% in severe drought or worse, which is, I would say, more unusual for them than it is for us to be that bad in drought.
What does that mean?
Well, in terms of, clearly, I think they probably had some issues with how their season finished out on, corn and soybean. Depending on your location, it will depend on how much that impact that had on your yield. But what concerns me right now for a lot of the Midwest is that if we are in drought now, it's harder to break a drought in the cold season. Now, Illinois breaking drought in the winter is a more feasible possibility than it is for, say, central western Nebraska, western South Dakota, where it's just much more difficult to get that good moisture in the winter. There are some good chance of moisture in some areas that are kind of deeply embedded in drought. So that's good. We can at least get some moisture back in the soil. But you don't want to go into the winter short of moisture, because that means you are likely going to start the next season short of moisture, which means that you either need a very wet spring, which is not ideal for a number of reasons, or B, you better not miss a single precipitation event the next growing season if your spring isn't wet. I mean, you have very little margin for error.
That sounds like the ingredient for a little bit of market volatility then. If there's that, hey, this weather thing could be something to watch.
Yes, indeed. Now, we've had drought conditions in the fall on a fairly regular basis here the last 5 years, so this isn't necessarily that abnormal. I think it's worse in Illinois, Indiana than it's probably been in recent years. It's not as bad in Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, the Dakotas has probably been in recent years. But having it worse in Illinois is different than it being bad in Nebraska in terms of market volatility.
Well, yeah. I mean, before we started rolling, we were talking about some of the rain, both man-made and natural, that fell and the implications that had. Let's talk about your state of Nebraska there. What's the state of the moisture and what happened this year to get you to where you're at today?
Yeah, I mean, by and large, we actually had I would say, a pretty good year. It was the best year for moisture this decade, which is not saying much. 2022 was about the driest year on record, and 24, actually about average, but we got that through sort of extreme measures. But most places in the state actually had above average precipitation this summer, and there were some, very good rain-fed yields in places that don't always get them. So I'm talking portions of central, south central, maybe southwestern Nebraska actually had some pretty good rain-fed yields if you caught the rains at the right time. And, in terms of the fall, we actually, at least across southeastern and most of west central Nebraska, actually had some pretty good moisture for the first time in several years in the fall. So we're in a lot better shape here than I think we have been in some cases. The downside is we did get some dryness late season across northeastern Nebraska. They are now back in drought. We now are back at like 15% of the state in drought, which is more than where we were a month ago. Still, compared to the last 5 years, that's still pretty good. But all in all, I mean, I think for rain-fed conditions, it was generally a pretty good year. I don't know that some people probably had records, some people not. Irrigated yields, I think, particularly on corn, I think often were fairly disappointing. I think a lot of that was a reflection of we had some major disease issues this year. Southern rust was horrendous for a lot of farmers. I think it was probably for maybe not everybody, but I know for a lot of folks it was the worst year they've ever had for Southern rust. This is kind of back-to-back years where it's been a real stinker of an issue. And one of the things that we're really trying to solve in extension, it is like, can we actually get better predictability when this may actually arrive? Because if we can do that, then we can better help pinpoint where it actually is coming in, and then have good management practices on it in terms of getting it put on at the exact right time.
What I have been fascinated is the discussion I've had with farmers just in Iowa who are not that far apart geographically in places, and how the southern rust impacted them differently. Some will tell you, oh yeah, we were just way too wet. Some were like, we were wet, but we were fine. We were dry, we weren't fine. I mean, there's this variability that doesn't seem to be anything consistent yet. We still believe southern rust goes away from year to year. It doesn't hang around.
It
right?
does not overwinter. Yeah, the plant pathologists that I work with and trust, it does not overwinter anywhere near here. They like to get into northern Mexico, maybe deep South Texas, where it actually overwinter. You know, our winters are getting warmer on average, but they're still way too cold for southern rust to survive. But it does blow back up in this part of the country every single year, and we've had very persistent southerly flow at probably the wrong times in recent years. So it's been coming in right during that late vegetative, really reproductive stage. And if you don't catch it, you don't the fungicide applied at the right time, it may not be that effective. And I think that was a common complaint I heard, is that the fungicides maybe were not as effective because they maybe were not applied at the right time, or because the spore pressure is just so great that the fungicide maybe it worked, but it didn't work like you wanted it to.
Right. That's very consistent with what I heard. Okay. Speaking of consistency, you and I, when we get together here lately, I'm just going to walk you through your presentation, and we're going to put up some of your slides. Let's start with corn yields. You've got a picture here. This is the expectations. Again, we don't have government data, so we're relying on FBN for this data, and we've also seen some private estimates. By the time you hear this, we will have had some government data, just not a lot. At least that's the plan. Well, right, we're supposed to have USDA on Friday, so supply and demand.
I'm actually really curious what some of those numbers look like, because I've been sort of on maybe not the bandwagon, but I've been sort of thinking that just based on the lack of solar radiation and some other factors this summer, that I would be very, very surprised if the yields were at certainly the August projections. I thought even the September ones were a little bullish. I still think it's a really good year. I just don't know that we're going to, I'm curious what they are.
Yeah.
But the FBN chart or map, again, this came off of Twitter. So, or I'm sorry, I guess they call it X now. But take it with a grain of salt. But I think it does show that particularly like the Highway 30 corridor from Nebraska into Iowa, getting up into Minnesota, there were a lot of people that said their corn yields were below expectations. Given that that's some of the most prime ground in the country, my guess is that if most of them are showing their yields are below expectations, I would be really surprised if that 188 number actually was verified. Now, granted, their expectations may have been very, very high this year. I don't know what their expectations actually were. So I'm not saying this is reflective of what the final numbers will be, but it does show that broadly across the north central U.S., that people are saying their corn yields are disappointing. And that sort of, I think, kind of lines up what we've been hearing from numerous people throughout this region.
And was there any one reason? Maybe lack of sun, or just the lack of moisture, or too much moisture, then no moisture?
I think it was a combination of a lot of things, but the lack of sun, particularly during grain filling, was an issue. So if you look at so Eric Snodgrass produced this figure a while back that was showed from like mid-June to early August, showed that basically the entire central U.S. was deficient on solar radiation. But I also was able to make a graph using the Iowa Environmental Mesonet using Era 5 data. So I picked York, Nebraska as an example. And so like during that period from like mid-July through late July, most days were below average on solar radiation. Some days were significantly below average on solar radiation. That is the absolute wrong time of year to have that happen. Like that's the peak of, pollination and starting early grain filling. I liken that to trying to train for a marathon by skipping supper almost every day. Like it's not good nourishment. You don't want to do that.
Excellent reference right there. Love it. Training for a marathon. I'm not a runner, but I know that I've runners in my life. Yeah. Have you? No, and as you've seen me in person, Eric, you can tell I haven't skipped many dinners. We talk about precip, and again, that mention of it was great for a while, then it stopped. Average, we're going to look, when we put it all together, 2025 is going to look like what when it comes to moisture? Is there going to be is that one number going to tell the story?
I think a lot of places are going to be above average just because it was so wet. I mean, there were places in north central, northeastern Nebraska that had more than their annual's worth of precipitation in the summer months. So we speak of summer, meteorologists are talking June 1st, August 31st. So that's a little different than astronomical. But some places, especially in late June through early August, were very, very wet, especially between I-80 and I-90. And it's possible some places just flat out had too much moisture. Crops need moisture, but there is absolutely such a thing as too much moisture for a plant. If your soils are too waterlogged for a couple of weeks, like your roots are going to have anaerobic conditions. They like oxygen just like we do. If they're not getting it, it's going to put an undue stress on the plant. There actually are parts of Iowa that their worst yields, like the last 50 years, 1993, when they just had way too much water that summer.
Right. And we had posted a video recently on our market YouTube page of 93. And I was looking through the harvest video, and it was the camera had clearly captured some of the ponding that had happened at that time during the year. And then the comments section started to light up about people were like, yeah, 93 was terrible because of this and this, not just because of this and this, but it really left a lasting impact. People haven't forgotten about just how problematic 93 could be. Is there still a comparison between the two for you?
Maybe in a couple isolated areas. I mean, 93 was a much more prolonged event. And the other, I would say the key difference, though, was we were already relatively wet in the north central U.S. going into that summer. And then we just were exceptionally wet. I mean, some places in southern Iowa had 40 inches of rain in like less than 3 months. We didn't have quite that level of moisture this summer, but we did have a lot of places where 20, 25 inches fell in, say, 6 to 8 weeks or something like that, which is excessive. But the fact that our antecedent conditions for what we had going into this, early summer were generally average, or in a lot of cases were dry. Like a lot of the Western Corn Belt, especially, was fairly dry going into the June. So that moisture, at least initially, was very beneficial. And then it was probably too excessive in some places. When you count that in with the, cloud cover, high humidity, warmer minimum temperatures, there just are a lot of factors that were working against having, the optimal type of yields. And, the lack of sun, higher humidity, those are all things that are very, very, very good for Southern rust. Like you could not have actually dreamt up a better recipe for Southern rust, at least in parts of Nebraska and Iowa.
Ah, the perfect recipe for Southern rust. I don't think that's going to be served at Thanksgiving meal anytime soon. Our temperatures, what did our 90-day temperatures have to factor into this?
The 90-day temperature. So what we saw this summer was kind of similar to what we've seen in other recent summers, where the maximum temperatures were not impressive. Matter of fact, they were, in like cases, below long-term averages. It was the minimum temperatures that were warm, and they were especially high in places like Illinois and Indiana. There are parts of Indiana and Illinois that had some of the warmest minimum temperatures on record for the summer months. They were generally about average across the entire region. And those warm minimum temperatures are detrimental to crop development, particularly for corn if you get them at the wrong time. I don't think we were necessarily setting that many records this summer. It was just the persistence of it just being just a little bit warm at night. That's a kind of consistent signal with what we've seen in the last couple decades. Planet getting warmer, ocean temperatures are warmer. It's just harder to maintain those cooler nights in the summer that we maybe used to get, even if our average temperatures overall don't look that impressively different in midsummer.
And I'm going to say that continued into September and October. And I'm just going to use Friday nights as an example for high school football. I think I made it all the way to week 8 or 9 before I even needed a jacket. And there were like 6 weeks where it was just like you could be in short sleeves and be fine. So yeah, we not only warm summer, but then you're not going to say that I have the right name of fall, but the fall months of September, October seemed warm too.
No, there was a little cool. We actually were very cool in this region to start September. Then we flipped back over warm. We were generally warm in October. In some cases, we were record warm early October. And we have seen a lot more of that in recent years. We generally are warmer in September. In some cases, a lot warmer September than we were 30, 40, 50 years ago. That is just another sign that we are seeing, things warm up.
We did have a bunch of snow over the weekend. It was crazy to think Montana to Iowa. I even saw weather delays Monday morning because there was still snow on the ground. Moisture at that type of moisture in November still goes into the ground. So,
yes,
where's our drought monitor? I still see the West is dry, Texas back over to Florida, Georgia, Alabama, but then it's that Ohio River Valley back towards St. Louis that's still a problem. What is the area, if I look at the drought monitor, that stands out to you most?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a bit of drought across the country. I mean, it's interesting. You kind of see drought. Then there's, the Great Plains, Western Corn Belt region is not as bad. Central Corn Belt, pretty bad. Not as bad like Appalachia, then really bad in New England. So it's just kind of like, you just kind of see who's been getting moisture the last 2 or 3 months. I would say in the north central part of the country, the biggest concern I have really is that area from central Illinois into western Ohio. The good news is for that area is I do think there is possible getting some improvement in the next, say, couple of weeks with some decent moisture. New England has a pretty good chance of getting some improvement this winter. That's good. The West, that's really going to depend on where the active storm track is. Given that we are in a La Niña, there's a lot of things that would probably suggest that the Pacific Northwest would do better on moisture. The Southwest into Texas, the prognosis certainly less good, but we may actually, we are going to see some moisture in some of these places here the next couple of weeks. The Southwest has seen some improvement. The monsoon was very, very late this year, but it did actually come in. So we did get some moisture in parts of Arizona and Colorado and Utah and New Mexico back in, August and September. So that did help alleviate drought conditions there to a point. I forget what tropical system was that moved in there, but there were some places in Arizona and Colorado that had tremendous amounts of rain. You saw a couple categories of improvement on the drought monitor in 1 week, which is relatively unusual. But I would just say that we've seen some of the, I'm going to call the southern part of the Midwest has seen some improvement in the last month, but we've seen just kind of continued drought conditions and even some degradation a bit further toward the north and toward the west. So we have seen things go a bit sideways across parts of Minnesota, Iowa, and Nebraska here in the last month. Even this week, we did see some additional degradation, just my home state. I do help write the recommendations for the state of Nebraska every week, and I did ask the author for more drought and more abnormal dryness across the state. And I think there's definitely pockets of the state that are flirting with severe drought at this point again, which is unfortunate, but that's just kind of how things go here.
We talked about the markets a little bit earlier, but when you look at from North Dakota, South Dakota, majority of Nebraska, Kansas into northern Oklahoma, out of drought, which means conditions for planting winter wheat are going to be good. Therefore, the market doesn't see any stress on the crop of the U.S., so, I mean, that's working against the wheat market right now.
Oh, sure. Well, the good news for the actual wheat crop itself, though, is that this is probably, especially for parts of southwestern Nebraska and Kansas, northern Oklahoma, they've had good moisture this fall for the first time in several years. So they actually, were able to get the crop in. And, my understanding is the wheat looks pretty good. So, I mean, they actually started planting winter wheat in parts of the western panhandle back in early mid-September. They plant it late September, October as you get a little further toward the east. But there's actually, if you look at the areas where we traditionally grow wheat, the drought conditions really are not bad. And my understanding, talking to some of the educators out west, is that the stand this year looks much better than it has in recent years. So it's off to a good start. And if it gets off to a poor start, it's very, very difficult, even if you have a good spring, to get it back on track. So from a market standpoint, that's probably not the best news for getting the wheat prices up, but maybe there'll be something else that will help get those up.
Right. There's always something. There's always hope for crop failure somewhere to somebody else's, not your own. That's always what the story
One thing that is, I would say, an increasing issue, particularly in the southern plains with winter wheat, is if we get these really warm stretches in February, early March, the wheat starts coming out of its fertilization, and then you get a huge cold snap. It comes in early mid-March, it zaps it, and that can be a major issue in Oklahoma and southern Kansas. Hasn't been as much yet in Nebraska, but that may be coming.
And we always talk about you kill a wheat, you can kill it like 6 times or something, and before it even finally dies.
But I mean, it can only stand so much shock for it just is done. And wheat streak mosaic virus was a big problem in parts of the Panhandle, northeast Colorado this year. I mean, if you get a lot of hail around the pre-harvest period, that basically means that if you get that post-harvest volunteer wheat to survive, it probably is infested with that virus, because that virus is pretty easy. It's basically just kind of present. If you spray it, you can get rid of it, but a lot of people see that volunteer there every year. It's often not infested with that virus. So you often learn the hard way the following spring that you had a field that was infested with that virus. So I think that was a real concern in parts of Panhandle this year. People hopefully got out and sprayed that volunteer before they planted.
What's our outlook for drought then here?
Now, the outlook is, right now, the area that I think is the most concerning, at least according to CPC, would basically be the southern U.S., southern plains, and the southeast. That is more of a traditional La Niña look to, where the southern U.S. is warmer and drier than average. Interestingly enough, they didn't really show any drought expansion across most of the Midwest. I would generally think that's probably fairly accurate. I mean, I think historical precedent would suggest that Ohio, Indiana, maybe parts of Illinois would see some improvement going into the winter. That much I can see. I am concerned, though, that parts of Nebraska, maybe the Dakotas, might sneak their way back into drought. I think that is a bit of a concern of mine. We have been relatively dry in the High Plains region in the last month or so. And if we are getting more predominantly northwest flow, that can bring the Alberta Clippers with snow like we saw this past weekend. That's not a great moisture signal for the High Plains region. So we'll have to see.
But there is a potential for some moisture coming soon.
Yes, indeed. So as we move into next week, we should actually, especially if you get further toward the east in Iowa and Illinois, there's going to be multiple chances of moisture. But right now, it looks like there's a reasonably good system coming from the southwest into the southern plains that should start moving toward the north and northeast and bring good moisture to central plains, western corn belt. Probably really good moisture from, say, eastern half of Oklahoma up into Illinois and Indiana. So again, some of the areas that really are most drought stricken right now in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, stand to have a pretty good chance of getting some moisture back out our way. We may get some of the best moisture we've seen in the last month to 6 weeks, which is good. The ground right now is completely thawed. So if you do get good moisture, that's going to go in. You don't want a 2-inch rain in January, because it's probably going nowhere but the ditch and rivers. And, that may actually cause some major flooding issues. I do think there's going to be a chance of getting some snow in the western half of Nebraska and South Dakota later next week. Certainly some snow in the mountains, which is good for them.
So are we in a La Niña, or you've mentioned it a couple of times? Are we still in a La Niña?
We are absolutely in a La Niña. It's not a really, really potent La Niña. So essentially we have seen the easterly winds and the central equatorial Pacific have been somewhat enhanced here for the last couple of months. That pushes that cold water back toward the west. El Nino is the exact opposite. You basically see that, the relaxing of the easterly winds. In some cases, you actually see true westerly winds, and that pushes that warm water back toward the east, which basically means you have a lot more surface area on this planet with more water temperatures. You have more potential evaporation. So that's one of the reasons that El Nino kind of gives the Earth a fever in terms of air temperature. We tend to see an even elevated temperature rise compared to what we are basically on an escalator with temperatures around this planet. But El Nino tends to enhance it even more. We also are currently what we call the negative Indian Indian Ocean dipole. We still have a negative Pacific decadal oscillation. There's all sorts of factors that are going to have an impact on our overall sensible weather in the coming weeks and months. It's not just La Nina. But in general, when we think about La Nina in this portion of the country, we think about it being colder, particularly the Dakotas, Minnesota, often Nebraska and Iowa. Illinois is a little bit more of a dividing line. Eastern side of the Midwest tends to be warmer, tends to be a little bit wetter. So the Eastern Corn Belt has a reasonably good chance of picking up good moisture this winter. And that would be good, and especially areas that are dealing with severe and extreme drought. If we can get some good moisture the next 2 or 3 months, that means that they are going to be less reliant on getting good spring moisture. We tend to be warmer and drier state of Texas, Oklahoma. So areas that Oklahoma is kind of interesting because some parts of the state are doing fine with drought and other places are really in pretty bad shape. And one concern I have is if we stay warm and dry down there, but they may be in a really, really bad situation going in the next spring. 2011 was a horrendous year in Texas and Oklahoma. It really kind of had its origins late 2010 when it got really dry, late summer and fall. But certainly, especially the North Atlantic oscillation is basically looking at pressure differences between, Iceland and the Azores or Bermuda. You tend to have stronger low pressures near Iceland, higher pressure near the Azores. Sometimes that relaxes or almost reverses. And when you get a negative North Atlantic oscillation, you tend to have a lot more meridionals, meaning you're bringing a lot more air coming from Siberia and northern Canada down into the U.S. And if we see that coupled with polar vortex stretching, that is an indication that we may, at times this winter, be dealing with pretty cold conditions. So I think there is at least a reasonable possibility that we will be dealing with more sustained cold this winter in our region of the country we've had in recent years.
So the cold's coming, is what you're saying.
Yeah, there are signals in multiple models right now that suggest that we are probably looking at polar vortex stretching coming into play.
Oh, you did not just say that. Did you really?
Say that.
You did.
Yep.
Polar vortex. Really? Come on, Eric.
Yep.
You're supposed to be friendly to me.
Well, I'm friendly, but I like being honest. I like just giving it straight. And right now there are indications. So Judah Cohen, who was one of my former coworkers at Atmospheric Environmental Research, publishes a AO blog or Arctic Oscillation blog every week. And I was looking at it earlier, and he was basically talking about what happens in Siberia. Does it stay in Siberia? There are multiple indications that we are likely to see some stretching as we get into post-Thanksgiving, early December. And what I'm looking at in terms of like the European weeklies and a couple other projections show cold basically coming into the West and north central U.S. during this time period. It does remind me, just looking at the projected anomalies, it does remind me of what happened in, say, like late early December 2013, where we saw basically a huge ridge build up across Alaska. And, if you get a big ridge in the Gulf of Alaska and across the, state of Alaska, you tend to get to that corresponding northerly flow coming back down into some portion of the U.S., which basically means there's the gates of the Arctic are open into somewhere east of the Rockies, or maybe Rockies and further east. And in that case, we saw a lot of really cold temperatures across the northern high plains, basically getting into at least most of the Midwest is pretty cold during that time period. It was definitely very cold here. And we did get some snowfall across this region. We really have been very, very warm in general here in early December in recent years. So this actually could, if this does come to fruition, which I think is certainly possible, this would be a real break for what we've had in recent years, early December. So my recommendation would be, if you didn't use your heavy winter coat this past weekend in the Midwest, you're probably going to want to find it because it may be cold for a while as we head into early December. And I'm not going to discount the possibility of at least areas north of I-70 getting their first taste of some decent snowfall. And some places got some decent snowfall this past weekend, but I think there might be more widespread areas of snow. I'd also point out the CPC is also picking up on the signal in the 3 to 4 week their 3 to 4 week outlook. And the fact that it is showing up relatively prominently on a consistent basis in the European weeklies is an indication to me that something colder is coming. That's going to be a shock to our system, just given how warm it generally has been so far this fall, what we're dealing with this weekend. So post-Thanksgiving, watch out for the cold.
But I'm going to say, I think one of our last conversations, or at least one of our conversations here in 25, there was this discussion of we all remember 2012 as the drought year. And there were these whispers that we were going to be dry in this year, and it didn't come to pass. So I'm going to just hang my hat on that maybe that's not 100% right, given what we had in 2025.
Well, there's always a possibility that I'm wrong and we're all wrong. That certainly is possible, yes.
It wouldn't be the first time, and it's all right. So we've talked about the flashback to 2013 and the winter outlook. You mentioned December or Thanksgiving and December could be cold. Does this continue into January, February?
I think their indications are that, based on historical precedent, it would certainly seem reasonable that we will have at least cold stretches at times. Doesn't mean it's going to be cold every single day. And we don't really necessarily have like the really truly sustained cold as often as we used to. That's just one of the aspects of having a warmer planet. But there are a couple of things that make me think that we are probably in for colder temperatures. One being just that La Nina on average tends to be colder for regions like North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota can be colder. We are expecting a more active polar vortex in terms of stretching. So that also would favor colder temperatures coming into certainly areas east of the Rockies. And if we look at the years where we've had a La Nina coupled with a negative precipitational oscillation, that also is an indication that we tend to be colder than average, at least compared to like the last 30 years in this portion of the country. So there are a lot of signals that do show cold being favored. And the other thing I have a slide here that shows the European model's winter outlook. It actually is showing average temperatures for a lot of the north central U.S., maybe just slightly warm elsewhere. They hardly ever show anything cold in this region. They usually just basically they have a warm bias in their seasonal outlook, particularly in the winter. The fact that they aren't showing a warm signal is an indication to me that we may actually be relatively cold. That may not happen. That may not happen at all. Certainly is possible we may continue to see the persistent ridging in place over the western and central U.S., but there are signs that is going to start changing as we head into very end of November, really getting into December. And it's to caution people that, like I said, we haven't had that much cold weather in December in recent years, but not early December. They may have that this year for the first time in a little while.
So that's the European model. There's two slides I want to focus on here to close. Analog winter outlook. Tell me what that means.
So the analog winter outlook, that's basically what I did was looked at probably go back the last 20 years. We've had a La Nina of comparable strength of this year with a negative precipitational oscillation, because that also could have a relatively big impact on where we tend to see ridges and troughs set up in the northern hemisphere. And by and large, that would tend to show that we have a bit more troughing in the western central portion of the continent, which would bring colder temperatures, at least on average. Now, that may mean we just have a couple of really intense cold stretches here first with mild weather. But if you look at those analog years going back to, say, 2010, 11, 2020, 21, 21, 22, 22, 23, and then last winter, the composite of that was colder than average across most of the central, at least the north central U.S., warmer southeast, warmer New England, colder Pacific Northwest. Again, that is largely a La Nina signature, but also does have some of that precipitational oscillation signature in there as well. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean really robust snowfall for most of us. 22, 23 had a ton of snow across portions of northern part of Nebraska, northern Iowa. I know parts of Minnesota have hammered with snowfall that year, but then on average, we are not necessarily getting tons and tons of snow, in part because when we are in a La Nina, if that is a dominant signal, we tend to get more northwesterly flow, which can bring snow, but that tends to bring more of the 2 to 4, maybe 6 inch snow that's drier, with less moisture content, probably more wind, blows around, or maybe ground blizzard type conditions. To get the really intense snowstorms in the Midwest, we need what we call southwest flow coming up from California, New Mexico, bringing the Pacific moisture, and then you get lows developed off of the lead of the Rockies. So they develop in Texas Panhandle, southwestern Kansas, and then move over Kansas City. or they take a more southerly track and they get over the, say, like Atlantic, and they produce nor'easters in the Northeast. Or maybe some produce blizzards across other portions of the West. Regardless, you need that Southwest flow signature to produce those types of low pressure systems that can produce heavy snowfall, because that means they can really tap into the moisture from the Gulf. The worst case scenario is you get deep troughing in the West that's tied in with the polar vortex stretching, or just really deep cold air coming in from northern Canada, where you also get tap into moisture from the Gulf. That means you can get the worst of both scenarios. You get the cold and you get the big snow. We saw that for a period of time in 2014. That's actually what really was going on in those winters in the late 1970s. Predates my time, but those of you that are older, they remember those winters being really brutal with snowfall and the cold. That's essentially kind of what we had. We had the combination of the Southwest flow with the really, really cold coming in because of how amplified the flow was in the western U.S. That's not the projection this winter, but that's something to watch out for.
Anything making any sense for the spring outlook yet?
Yeah, in terms of the spring, there are projections that we are likely to transition back into neutral as we head into the spring, which I would say all things being equal is good, particularly for the Great Plains Western Flood Belt. La Niña in summer and fall does not tend to be our friends for moisture. So that's, I would say, on balance, that's good. There also is a chance that we may transition back into El Nino as we head into later summer. And if that happens, we may start seeing more moisture come back in the spring. Now, I would point out that 2022 to 2023, we were La Nina going to neutral, going into El Nino. And we tend to actually see better moisture in summer when that happens. Some years we do in spring, some years we do not. I don't have to remind people for this region, 2023, we were extremely dry. And hardly anything picked up on that. I'm not saying that's going to happen again, but just pointing out that the last time we did have a transition into an El Nino during a growing season, the spring was horrifically dry across a lot of this region. It was very, very detrimental to certainly parts of Nebraska, and I think it probably sets people back in other areas as well. Thankfully, we started getting moisture that summer, but we don't need a repeat of that again.
But one thing we do need a repeat of, you.
Good.
We'll have a repeat of you at some point again. Eric, good to see you. You can see Eric a number of ways. He's on Market Journal on Saturday mornings, the Crop Watch podcast, and also find some of his work on the Nebraska State Climate Office website. And you don't teach any classes, though, do you?
I actually do teach a class on the side in the fall. Yes, I do. I really enjoy the students. They're great.
What's the class this fall?
It's an honors class. It's called Living with Our Changing Climate. So essentially, none of them have any meteorology or climate background. So I try to teach them some fundamentals of weather and the Earth's climate. And we don't spend a lot of time talking about beliefs or attitudes. We spend more time actually talking about why we're seeing what we're seeing, why we're likely to see what we're going to see. Then we talk about solutions for adaptations, mitigations. Because, realistically, they're 20 plus years younger than me. They're going to have to deal with this in a different way than I'm going to deal with it. And I want them to be prepared for it.
Exactly. Have a base of information as they go to make their decisions. So
100%.
Eric, good to see you. Thank you so much. Appreciate the time.
Yep. Thank you so much, Paul.
All right. That's Eric Hunt. You know him from Nebraska. We know him from this podcast and many other things, which come out each and every Tuesday in audio and video form on YouTube. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Send me an email at markettomarket@iowapbs.org. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.